Okay, everyone, welcome to the second video regarding the frontal attack, rook endings, complicated rook endings, and very practical to know as they tend to occur from a lot of other endgames. As pieces get traded off rapidly, suddenly one side finds themselves with their king cut off from the pawn, and if they don't know the frontal attack, they're in big trouble. So, okay, let's get right to it. You'll notice from the, if those of you who watched our last video, video 1 on the frontal attack, we covered the basic ideas of how to draw this endgame when the king is only cut off one file. If you know the technique, the ideas are actually very straightforward, pretty simple, and not very much progress one can make once you've seen the idea. However, here we're looking at a position where the king is cut off 2 files from the pawn. 1, 2. And it really does make all the difference in the world. And typically, when the king is cut off more than a file, the endgame should be lost. So what we're going to do today is try to dissect these ideas and instruct everybody on why this endgame is a straightforward loss most of the time when the king is cut off 2 files. So, starting with this position, I would actually already recommend, especially if you just previously watched the third video of our rook ending series and the first video on the frontal attack, I would recommend taking a moment to try to ask yourself what you think it is that's changed in the position when the king is cut off 2 files. Obviously, the king is 1 file further from the pawn, but it's not exactly obvious why that changes the technique. If black is to make a waiting move here in some way, you would still have trouble making progress with the king based on his ability to check you from the front. So taking a moment to remind yourself or try to figure out what it is that's changed in this position because the king has cut off 2 files. So go ahead and do that. And okay, we move forward. So it's pretty interesting to see why the king being cut off 2 files makes such a big difference. So we're going to start by making progress with the king, which in the situations when the king was only cut off 1 file, would not have made much progress because once we reached this point, our options were either A, to come back and protect the pawn with the king, or B, bring the rook behind the pawn, which immediately allowed the king, which was only cut off 1 file, to come in front. So by seeing that, we kind of notice the difference here. After we've brought the king forward, the difference is that because this king is that much further from the pawn, now considering bringing the rook behind the pawn is definitely an idea because he's not able to immediately jump right in front, which would lead to an immediate draw based on the Philidor method. So after we bring the rook behind the pawn, black realizes that he's in a little bit of trouble here and has to try to rush the king back. Unfortunately, with the right ideas in mind here, black is not able to get back in front of the pawn in time. White gains a tempo on the rook and gains a second tempo, which I think is important to recognize if we stop about this for a moment. Just noticing how much the position is now rushed. Already, one of the obvious moves to consider would be to push the pawn, because the fact that even if he brings his king forward, it seems that we're there just about in time to win. However, not the case. And if he's able to check and repeat the checks, obviously we can't do that. And by coming up to the 6th rank, we've immediately walked into a what? What do we got now? Philidor position, right? Instant draw. So I think it's important to realize that whenever you have a chance to make life a little more difficult for your opponent, even if you're not sure why it improves the winning idea, you should do it. And here white takes advantage to gain a tempo on the rook twice, which is going to force the rook off of the d file. now the win is pretty straightforward. Again, here is a moment where I would recommend taking a pause to try to ask yourself, what do you think the most accurate winning move is here? Because I believe there are a couple. But the most accurate winning move is to take advantage of your improved king position, but not rush the pawn and come back to cut off the king. Because again, remember that the winning idea, our eventual goal in all these rook and pawn endings, as we mentioned in our first video, is to reach the Lucena position. Anytime you reach a position with the enemy king cut off one file and your king in front of the pawn, you have an easy win looking ahead to you because of the Lucena idea, because of the bridge. So here's a chance where white recognizes that, and rather than rushing the pawn, going into some complications of the king getting in front, which actually is still not optimal. We're not going to go into this here, but it's not an optimal defensive position for black because the king is on the long side of the pawn and the rook is actually on the short side of the pawn. If you remember video 2 talking about how our optimal drawing chances was the opposite of that. But again, what's the reason to even allow black that opportunity? Taking advantage of the king being cut off more than a file still is the most accurate way to move forward in this position. Now black tries to give checks, pretending he's on the long side. White gains a tempo, gains another tempo, and now finally, regardless of where the rook decides to defend himself, we push the pawn forward freely, confident that we will eventually achieve a bridge position because the king has cut off a file. Quickly, what we'll do is we'll play this one out. Always good to remind ourselves of a basic idea, just to instruct and show that once this king is hidden behind the pawn, and he's trying to maintain the progress of keeping the king cut off, the win is easy. In fact, here it's easy because the king is misplaced on f6. The king can just slide over and queen next move. But let's say we were a little bit smarter about that, defending, and we reach this position where our king is in optimal position, the rook is in an optimal position, but the winning idea is simple. The rook comes up to the 4th rank, checks the king away from the file, because if he blocks it, game over, no checks. And progress is made, we sidestep with the king, and once again, the king and rook provide the bridge of protection for the pawn. Lucena's easily winning idea, which, good to review, just so we remember what it is that white is playing for. When we start in this position, seeing the king cut off, we remind ourselves of our goal, which is to bring the king in front of the pawn so that we can advance and win with the Lucena idea. Okay, so this winning technique, much like you'll notice with a lot of these rook endgames, pretty much starting from the beginning of this video series to now, we can't cover every position. That's why we don't set up this position and then, move it one space over and one space over, because we'd be here forever analyzing positions that were endless and redundant. The key, of course, to chess is recognizing patterns. And what you need to know here is that whenever the king is cut off 2 files, this type of idea, this winning idea where you can make progress with your king and at some point transfer the rook behind the pawn, is a key idea that repeats itself more than once. And I'm saying that about pattern recognition because I think it's important when you study and listen to these videos that you don't get overwhelmed with, okay, whoever's doing the video isn't answering every little question you're coming up with, but focus on the forest through the trees, which is the ideas. Because the ideas repeat themselves, patterns repeat themselves. You can't cover every position in chess, but if you learn an idea and you really memorize that concept, it can be applied in sometimes tens to hundreds of positions, depending on what type of idea you're talking about. So again, the reason why we win when the king is cut off 2 files is because we now have the time to bring the rook behind the pawn without his king instantly hopping in front. He tries to bring the king back. We make sure we're as accurate as possible by gaining tempos. Now we take advantage of the king being cut off a file and basically force Lucena immediately with this move, and the game will be over because the king is cut off. Cannot prevent us from making progress. Very good. So position 2 of this video is always good because, of course, we move on once I tell you how important and instructive it is to memorize an idea because it applies in all positions. Now we move into a position where it doesn't apply, which is always good. So here we are in a position where the king has cut off 2 files again, but Black is not quite as worried about the straightforward plan of the king making progress for one simple reason. You'll notice that the difference of the pawn being here rather than here, means that this rook, when it slides over, will be on what side? The long side. One of the most important and instructive drawing ideas we talked about a few videos ago. So, by coming forward with the king, White learns that he's not actually making progress, because when he tries to come forward here, Black can probably go here or instantly transfer the rook over to the long side and show White that the series of checks is about to start. Checks, 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 and either the checks will continue to a draw or the king will probably have to retreat itself, thus allowing our king to go in front, which therefore allows the fillet or draw. Hopefully everyone understands that idea I'm talking about here. Basically checks, checks, checks until he either moves away or he tries to stay over here, which is not really going to make us stop checking him anytime soon. So the point is that here we have a position where the king has cut off 2 files, but the straightforward plan of making progress with the king and then punishing the king's distance from the pawn by coming behind the pawn doesn't work because the rook is on the long side. So the question is, well, is that mean this is an easy draw, or do we have any new features here? Is there anything new about the fact that the king is on the side of the board that may give us a different type of winning chance? Here I would recommend we pause the video and try to take into your mind what I just said there about recognizing the new problems of the king position, and see if you can find out what White's new tricks are in this position that create our winning ideas. Okay, so we're going to continue now, and what we're going to see White exploit here is not the straightforward idea of like we said, bringing the king up and bringing the rook behind the pawn, as that doesn't work. What we're going to see is him exploit the fact that the king now has mating issues. Because it's on the edge of the board, there's always this possibility of checkmate, especially if our king is to reach somewhere along the f-file here. So, first thing we're going to do in this position as White is we're going to make a waiting move. Kind of like that first position we started with in video 1 of the frontal attack. We make a waiting move to try to put Black into some sort of zugzwang. We're going to have to look at 2 main things here. The transfer of the rook immediately, which has to be a main possibility for Black to consider because the rook is on the long side. You know, he has to consider that idea. And the other thing is a waiting move by the king. An important thing to note is that an immediate advance of the king, which a lot of you, if you did pause the video and try to solve, might have tried to come up with this idea here. Move the king up. A check would fail to this, and it looks as though taking this pawn loses immediately to this move. Because coming over to stop checkmate loses because of that famous rook transfer, where now either checkmate is going to be had or the rook will be lost, depending on Black's choice of poisons. So, as many of you may have considered the immediate advance of the king based on this little mating trick, trying to take advantage of this idea, the backdoor rook move. However, it doesn't work here because Black does not have to move to the h-file immediately. By sliding the rook over to the other side of the board, he's ready to give checks, and if you give check first, he will now block, and no progress has been made. We can try to repeat, but we're not getting anywhere. So the immediate advance of the king does not work. We come back to our waiting move. So again, I said we're going to cover 2 things here. The obvious ideas of moving the king, and the idea that seems a little more practical based on the rook moving to the long side, and trying to draw based on similar ideas we've already seen black draw with. So first thing we're going to do is we're going to start with the king moves. What if the king moves to h6? Well, moving back is the easiest one to exploit, which is why we start with it, because we see if we do some simple calculations based on the fact that the king is in a mating net, we see that white comes forward, eventually reaches the square. The pawn cannot be taken based on checkmate, and if the pawn isn't taken, the pawn will go marching on. Checks don't help, obviously. We're already in a bridge position. The game is over. So the immediate retreat of the king does not work based on the fact that the mating idea is now even more obvious, and black cannot stop it. What about the more aggressive move with the king, king h4? This is a tricky move because our only answer to win is actually to repeat the position we just had by playing this waiting move, followed by starting back to our original position, except one crucial difference. It is now black to move. Let's review that real quick and ask ourselves, why did black have to go here, thus allowing us to reach that position with zugzwang? Well, if he doesn't retreat the king after rook to g7, white's threats are pretty simple. Now that he's along the 7th rank, he's threatening to advance his king and eventually block with the rook, block checks with the rook, trade rooks into a winning king and pawn ending. So let's see, how would we exploit that? Let's say the king moves, we start this advance idea. Eventually we reach a position where the rooks are traded. We reach a position where the rooks are traded, and the king and pawn ending is winning. So by bringing the rook to the 7th rank, black is forced to come back with the king. Why does this prevent it? Well, it prevents it because if the king tries to come forward now, before we start giving checks, we attack the rook. And if the rook moves off of the file, trying to maintain the 7th rank idea, he's allowed us back in front of the pawn. We're going to get closer to a Philidor draw and draw here actually pretty easily now. Just by losing the control over this file changes the whole position. And if he maintains it, well, now he's no longer threatening to block with the rook along the 7th rank. We start our checking process, and as you see, actually with the king on h6, there's a second win here, where here we see with the king on h6, white again is able to exploit this idea of the king being in a mating net. And so the most accurate way for black to draw the endgame is first to give the check, which forces the awkward position of the king, and now attack the rook. Forcing the black rook to either repeat, the white rook to retreat, or to stay along the 7th rank and allow the king back in front of the pawn. Okay, so after we bring the rook to the 7th rank and the king moves up to h5, we bring the rook back to g1, and now we're in the original position we had, except the crucial difference being that it is black to move. So what have we discovered? We discovered that king h6 lost based on the advance of the king and the obvious mating ideas. We discovered that king h4 loses because now with the rook on this side, rather than g2, with the rook all the way on the g1 square, now the advancement of the pawn wins instantly. If black captures the pawn, we attack the rook, also threaten mate, and black loses instantly. Of course, anything but capturing the pawn is only going to allow us to make progress and eventually reach a Lucena position. So we've lost our way a little bit, and that's because this is complicated. I'm trying to give the most explanation we can for sometimes very tricky rook ending ideas. But the basic point can be said here that 2 files is almost always losing for the kings. We saw the most straightforward idea to win with the 2 file cutoff in the last position. This position, not quite as simple because the rook being on the long side. but the king being on the edge of the board has created mating net possibilities when our king reaches one of these squares. And depending on what square he gets to, it seems to always be there. So let's look at it again. We make a waiting move. King h6 loses because we eventually get a mating net on this square, and he can't guard that as well as the pawn. King h4 loses, not right away to this e5 idea, because after captures king up, he can attack our rook, and we've reached a drawn position. But by making a waiting move along the 7th rank and threatening to make progress with the block, he's forced to retreat the king to the original square. We also go back, thus putting him in zugzwang, where both this move loses because of the basic idea, this move loses because of e5, followed by king up and the mate threats. And finally, moving the rook to the long side loses because of the last idea we haven't reviewed, which is pushing the pawn. He tries the same idea we saw in the original frontal attack position, the video 1 of the frontal attack. However, the major difference is that because the king has cut off 2 files, as we knew it would be, after pushing the pawn all the way down and forcing the rook back, Black doesn't quite have the time to come over and win this pawn and get his king out of the awkward mating net at the same time. White comes forward. Black eventually has to capture the pawn. Otherwise, bam, bam, game over. And again, we reach a similar position where the rook seems to always be hanging, combined with the threat of checkmate, thus putting Black in a lost position. So, last idea, instructive, I think, to review, just to show one more time the power of the problem of the king being in a mating net and the power of white combining the threats of mate with the pawn push. If the rook goes to the long side, you can even do it right away without our combination of zugzwang that we did. If you remember, coming to the 7th rank and then going back. He can even do it right away if he wants. But our idea is the same. After he cuts us off and we go to the 6th rank, if he waits with the king, we will push the pawn, eventually come up, combine the power of mate with the pawn. And the last idea he has is to come to the 6th rank, but again, loses to the same exact mating idea of exploiting the problem with the king and the rook at the same time. So, this concludes our video 2 of the frontal attack, and hope you enjoyed it. These are a complicated endgame to understand, and I think that if you have the ability to review these videos more than once, and I apologize for moments where we may have talked fast or sounded confusing, but overall, I think hopefully the ideas are clear and instructive, and for both winning and drawing these endgames. And so we would summarize with this. Generally, when the king has cut off 1 file, it should be an easy draw based on the transfer of the rook to a long side away from the pawn and that cutoff idea we saw in video 1. When the king has cut off 2 files, it is always a loss, except for one exception, which we're going to talk about quickly here, and that is with a knight pawn. And the reason why this will be simple to talk about is because the knight pawn draws for very obvious reasons. There is no mating net now because the king is not on the edge of the board. So our other winning idea was to run the king away, right? So our rook could come back. Only problem, there is no Z file. There is no negative file here. So by trying to bring your king over and eventually your ability to move away from the pawn, not allowing a check, is not there. You don't have the ability to move away from the pawn, which means that your progress is limited. Eventually, you'll realize this and come back in front of the pawn, and Black is never has to worry, because without your ability to move to the Z file, as we'll call it, you don't have the ability to make progress. So, other than the knight pawns, generally 2 files being cut off from the king is always a loss. And generally 1 file is typically a draw, except for that one exception we saw, which we will review one more time, where the king was in the awkward position equal to the pawn or behind the pawn, which allowed white this trick of cutting off the king and then making easy progress after that. Okay, I hope everybody enjoyed the video. I hope your knowledge of rook endings is improving rapidly day by day. Thank you for listening.